So, Mr. Hargrave here. We're going to cover today Chapter 5, your sections 1 through 3 guided reading packet. We're just going to kind of walk through the PowerPoint today. This is going to be through Edpuzzle, and so I'll add in a few questions that I normally have asked during class on Edpuzzle. And so um, let's get started. All right, so section 1 here is Heartland of the Cotton Kingdom, and so it's going to break down for us a little bit, and what you read is a little bit of how cotton influenced Mississippi here. We're going to kind of go way back before the Civil War, what life was like during the antebellum period, and during the early 1800s with the spreading of cotton. So right here in this introduction talks about the Southern way of life was defined before the Civil War there in the antebellum period. We talked about how that is the period where we see this huge flush of income for that planter class. So plantations were the associated with the wealth, social prestige, and class of these Mississippians, and most of those are going to be our white Mississippians there. All right, so going back here to the cotton gin, just a recap, again, late 1700s, early 1800s, when we see the introduction of the cotton gin and the importance of the cotton gin to the Southern culture is very important. Says the cotton gin is arguably the most important machine in Southern history because it allowed cotton to be quickly produced and then sold out of the South to the rest of the world. All right, so the cotton economy, plantation system, and the cotton economy influenced almost every aspect of life in antebellum Mississippi. We talked about this a little bit, but whenever Mississippi's economy is doing good, it's because the cotton economy is doing good. And so it dictated all these social, political affairs for the state, was determined by cotton, the picking season, the planting season, all those things. And so we see here on this graph how the cotton boom, or that flush times that we talked about, happened just before 1860 here when we get to the Civil War. Right before that, but we'll say kind of backing up right here during 1830s, mid 1830s. We had that president that we talked about that kind of expanded more territory for the planting of cotton, especially in Mississippi and Alabama. And so we see that start to really increase once we get more expansion of slavery throughout the southern states. And we see that huge exponential growth here in that flush time period in the mid 1840s to 1860 there. All right, and so we're going to have a few sections here that y'all read about in section 1 of the different people that this cotton economy affected. Of course, the biggest one is going to be those large planter classes. These are going to be our large slaveholders who owned 50 or more slaves and farmed at least 500 acres of land. All right, so these large planters were, we saw kind of a small portion, I think it was like 4.5% of Mississippi's population owned more than, 50 slaves at a given time, which only is a small percent of the population, but that small percent still owned a large portion of slaves here in Mississippi. They dominated the state's economic and social status, both in the production and selling of cotton, but also we'll see here these large planters were part of the Whigs Party. If we remember, the Whigs and Democrats were the two political parties in Mississippi at this time, and so they represented mostly the Whigs, and they tried to keep the controversy over slavery to a minimum here. The reason for that is that they feared that the continued, distrust between the North and the South would eventually lead to secession and war, which would not be beneficial for these large planters, because any type of war would cause economic issues to begin with. Plus, they were selling a lot of their products to the North, who would then turn it into textile industry, and the North would turn that into clothing. And so they want to have that good relationship with the North, this large planter class. And the opposite of these large planter class people are going to be our small planters. So smaller planters were defined as people who owned between 20 and 30 or 20 and 50 slaves and farmed between 200 and 500 or 200 and 500 acres. All right, so these are going to be our smaller planters. These would kind of be, we would kind of say, our people who are wanting to aspire to be those large planners. So you kind of say they're kind of this middle class group of people. They own enough land and enough slaves to have some type of power. We're going to see that here in a second. But they were not as powerful or economically viable as we see those larger planter class. Um, excuse me there. But small planters hope to be as successful as those large planters. They wanted to increase their land and their slave count. They saw that as having a larger status, and they always wanted to strive to be one of those larger planters. But many small planters were Democrats, so they were the other party that was in Mississippi at this time. And they felt threatened by the abolitionists. So again, those are people who were wanting to abolish slavery. And we'll talk about that some more later. But they felt threatened by these people wanting to get rid of slavery or stop the expansion of this. And so these small planters supported an expansion of slavery to the west. This expansion would allow them to have more possibilities of acquiring more land. We kind of see this later on with the Mexican-American War. All right, and then lastly here, kind of on the lower end of the class system or the status system here, we have farmers. Small farmers owned less than 20 slaves and farmed less than 200 acres. Farmers made up the largest group of slave owners. When you talk about a owner to slave ratio, these farmers owned more slaves per per person per owner than any other classes. Small planters and farmers both dreamed of becoming wealthy through having more slaves in more western areas and expanding their territory. And so because of their numbers, small farmers were a powerful political force during the 1850s. And this is going to be important because during the 1850s, we're going to see specifically this group of people, the small farmers and small planters, be the driving force in getting persuaded by those group of people that will later be called fire eaters, who are pushing for secession. And so the abolition of slavery crushed our hopes of becoming wealthy post-Civil War. But leading up to the Civil War, these groups of people are going to be the ones who are important in trying to promote the expansion of slavery, hearing these fire eaters, pushing for secession. It's going to be these guys who are also going to be the ones on the front lines fighting to keep this institution of slavery alive in the South. We're going to quickly go through education during this time under the kind of cotton kingdom and cotton regime here of Mississippi. So most school-age children in Annabella, Mississippi lived on farms scattered throughout the state. We kind of talked about how in Chapter 1, the growing season kind of dictated when you would go to school. And so because farm required little education, we don't really see a big demand for public schools. And with farming being those farmers having the most populated group in the state at the time, we're not going to see a big demand for public schooling. Larger planters would normally get tutors or private teachers to teach their children there on those large plantations. And there were some private academies in the state. And so, but we normally see if you got any type of schooling higher than high school, you're mostly going to the north for college or across the Atlantic to Europe to get any type of college degree. So again, limited education specifically for women, girls in the traditional household. Girls and women were kind of seen as, their roles were defined by serving, were meant to serve at the home, tending to the needs of husbands and children. And so that's kind of the old South mentality of women, again, are weak both physically and mentally, saying that they cannot comprehend as much as the male population intellectually. Sorry. Um, and so their roles are mostly going to be defined by what they can do in the house. And so women are going to play the important role in controlling other women in the form of slavery. And so we're going to see women, slave women, coming into the household being controlled by the women of the planter class. And so we're going to see that as kind of a clash that happens within the household, where on the outside, that's where you're mostly seeing those overseers, the male overseers, or male planters, the owners, kind of controlling what goes on in the fields. Um, Again, we kind of talked about this already. I'm going to briefly go through again, but educating slaves was for the most part prohibited. There was a state law prohibiting the education of those slaves. Free blacks did acquire some education, but again, we're going to see that they're going to be fearful of those free blacks, and trying to educate slaves, because if you're an educated slave, you will be able to realize that you will eventually, we'll get to this, but you'll eventually outnumber your white owners by a good bit. That if you were able to educate them on this, unite them all together, they could easily overtake their white owners. I'm going to skip this section because we've already talked about it, and this. Last section here, or the last part here in this section, um, one kind of talks about just again, the first university that was set up for public use through public funds is going to be the University of Mississippi, opened in 1848. Um, and the money granted us was given from the United States Congress. But we did talk about the first college established in Mississippi was going to be the historic Jefferson College just outside of Natchez. But our University of Mississippi, located in Oxford, is going to be the first state university paid for by the United States government. And we will see more towns start to pop up as we start to see the growth of cotton economy, and Natchez, Jackson, Vicksburg. Those areas are going to be very much important in the transportation of cotton. All right, section 2, chattel slavery. Again, in the Constitution of 1817, we did reaffirm that chattel slavery, or the system of labor for Mississippi where slavery would be legal, was approved there in the Constitution of 1817. So it's meant that by law and custom, African American slaves were personal property of their owners and could be bought, sold, traded, and inherited. We talked about that inherited part last class, um, by their owners. And so we're going to see kind of the origins of slavery, bringing it all the way up until now. The origin of slavery, again, kind of goes back to ancient times, brought over here through the triangular slave trade to the New World from Africa, first introduced in Jamestown, Virginia. The French in the Mississippi Territory will use both Indian and African slaves to kind of help till up the land and grow the crops here in Mississippi. And so eventually we'll see African American slaves will become the most widely used form of slavery here in Mississippi versus Indian slaves. Increase in slave population, again, we see here on this chart, why does you see it kind of grow exponentially right after 1790 into the early 1800s? Again, the answer for that's going to be because of the cotton gin kind of explodes, that pushed for more slaves are needed to grow more cotton. Because we're starting to see an expansion of land here in the 1830s, we see another jump for the expansion of slavery. And so a few factors happen there. And by the 1840s, we first start to see where slaves start to outnumber the white population here in Mississippi. Again, if we would have seen any type of unity or unification between the slaves in Mississippi, they could have easily outnumbered their white counterparts. But again, between fear tactics that we described and the lack of education, it was very hard for them to unify at all in Mississippi. So over the next 20 years, the black population continued to grow faster than the white population, all the way up to 1860. All right. Our book does kind of go into the three types of slaves in antebellum Mississippi. You had your field slaves, house slaves, and town slaves. Field slaves, we've kind of talked about a good bit already. Their lives, went from sundown or sun up to sundown, driven by an overseer. Their lives were dictated on the planting season, so the 200 and whatever days, whether you're in the north or southern part of Mississippi, that's how long you were out there in the fields. Outside of that, they may have you do other work as well outside of the growing season. That included both men, women, and children. 5 or 6 years old is about when you would start to work in the fields. Again, we go back to our last class, talked about how younger slaves are more valuable to be working out in the fields than, say, an older slave. Where an older slave might be helpful, especially have a lot of experience, would have been right here in the house slaves. Cooks, housekeepers, butlers, gardeners, carriage drivers, or traveling companions. These were either usually women or older men or older women, or even some girls were used here as house slaves. Some other slaves would resent them sometimes because they were given special treatment. But I'll say the reason for that special treatment or privileges is because they're trying to impress other white planters. And so they want to make sure that if you are a wealthy or well-off white plantation owner, you are going to show that by how you treat your slaves as well. This whole kind of decorum that you have when you invite guests over here in the Old South era, and how your slaves dressed and looked. If they looked proper, it showed that you had wealth enough to where you can take care of yourself and your slaves. And again, the more slaves you have, the higher status you had in society. And so house slaves were sometimes resented by those field slaves because they got treated this way. But again, there was a reason for why they were treated in this way. It was for, influencing the other white planters who'd come and visit that plantation. And then town slaves is something that doesn't really get talked about too much in history, all right, in our history books, but they did exist. So these town slaves were pretty much, owned by, other slave owners, but basically they kind of rented them out to the town. If you kind of think, again, we're going to be using the way that we got to put our hats on this time period, but if we think of them as property, as the way that they thought that they were property, this is kind of like renting out different construction equipment, and so instead of construction equipment, it's people, and these people are doing certain things as being cooks in the town. Blacksmiths were a big thing in the town. Day laborers, so people who are constructing buildings in the town. You could almost say that D.C. was constructed. Washington D.C. I think somebody brought this up in one class. Somebody asked, wasn't D.C. built on the backs of slaves? Answer to that is yes, and those are mostly the town slaves. Somebody basically lent the town of Washington, D.C., these slaves to build the different construction projects for the town. And so same thing happened here with these town slaves. They lived in small quarters there, and they're properly fenced in and gated and guarded. And they were usually hired or rented by their owners, like we mentioned, and the salary go towards their owner. Again, plantation management, we talked about the overseer was going to be the main person that enforced kind of the slave codes, the rules of the plantation. And then we talked about, this was our summarizer last class, but again, the number one most important aspect of the slaves' lives was their family. And so family ties and kinship were very important to them. the values, ideals, morals, and self-image of slaves are shaped and molded in the slave quarter. And so those small little shacks that they lived in, the slave quarters, is where ideas, education, if they could have any type of education, would take place late at night, where they would practice their different religions, where they would organize, they would talk. This was kind of like the community center was in these small little slave quarter shacks on the plantation. So slave parents worked to build their children up with a positive self-concept and self-esteem. But again, they had to work on this because of the constant, pushing down of, you know, degradation of being a slave by overseers and by plantation owners. And so the white world, this last part is kind of important. The white world is a slave secondary environment. Slaves judged each other by how they conducted themselves within the white community, but not within the white community, but within the slave community. And so they kind of saw their lives kind of split into two here between the white community, how they had to act within the white community, and how they had to act with the slave community. This kind of showing us how they had to act differently between the two. By forcing them to do that, we kind of see how this will force later on Jim Crow, separate but not equal, or separate but equal, kind of air quotes there, and how even blacks within their own community will start to feel by the time we get to the civil rights movement, especially with the Black Panther movement, that hey, we don't need to be forcing integration if we can survive on our own. And we've always been a part of our own community. We're going to stay within our own community versus try to integrate, because we're seeing the violence that's happening just over trying to integrate schools. And so we're going to see how early on they're already having to separate themselves between the two communities that they live in. And then again, that second most important thing was religion. Some of these plantation owners would take their slaves to church with them, but depending on how many they had, or they would have the church service on site on the plantation sometimes. But outside of what was being taught by a white preacher to white plantation owners and with their slaves present, on the same day, kind of after, in the afternoon period, you normally see the slaves themselves have a praise meetings where they would have express themselves through songs, chants, dances, whether it be Christianity or even some religious practices early on in slavery resembled some of their African heritage as well. We'll talk some more maybe about this as we get closer to the civil rights movement, but we do see a Mississippi Colonization Society will set up funds to send free blacks back to Africa, those who wanted to, started in 1831. And again, we talked about how Mississippians are very fearful of these free blacks, so the more they can send them out of Mississippi, the better for them, because there's a specific reason why they don't want them here. And that specific reason is because they think that they're going to incite slave revolts by educating those slaves. But again, we do see free men of color here in Mississippi, 773. Free men, women, and children in Mississippi were here in 1860. But again, their rights and privileges were still restricted under this time. Most of these free blacks were descendants of former slaves, but some had freed themselves or had been freed by their owners, either through a will. So then instead of inheriting, if they didn't have anybody to inherit slaves, in the will they'd say, set my slaves free. Others had saved up enough money to purchase their freedoms if their slave owner agreed to this. And then the freedom of their families would also be tied into there as well. And again, that last part here, some white Mississippians were worried that the presence of free blacks might create a desire for freedom among the slaves in bondage. We talked about William Johnson already and the runaway slaves and slave resistance using those fear tactics to prevent this right here, slave revolts, from happening. We do see in 1835 this kind of hysteria that happens where people are thinking that there might be a slave revolt spreading, and many slaves will be lynched during this time. We talked about what lynchings were. Those were when, we see specifically blacks, but also sympathetic whites killed for helping, slaves or blacks in Mississippi try to get their rights or get their freedoms. And so they'd usually be hung or brutally killed because of that. All right, in our last section here, section 3, slavery, states' rights, and secession here. I'm going to kind of read off some of the stuff from the PowerPoint, but also I'm going to go back through our section 3 guided notes and talk about this as well. So, introduction. Again, the South is known as the Bible Belt. Most of us probably know this. Mississippi is considered the buckle of the Bible Belt because it is kind of the center piece that kind of brings together both the kind of southeast and southwest sides of the South, and Mississippi is kind of the center for religion for all of the South here. So religion plays an important role in Mississippi. Most of us know this. Churches are characterized by their intensity or fervor and their acceptance of the literal interpretation of the Bible. Concepts of good and evil we'll get to talk about in a second as well. We're also going to see kind of politicians and newspapers, the fire eaters spreading kind of this movement for secession as well. And so by 1861, Mississippians were advised by everybody that there was only two choices: either submit to the North or secede from the Union and form a new Southern nation. All right. But let's talk about why these people here in Mississippi during this time were so adamant in leaving the Union because of whether it be slavery, states' rights, a mixture of the two. We'll talk about that here. We're going to see what kind of leads us up to this. And so in regards to slavery and how they viewed slavery, early on when Mississippi became a state, most whites that lived here in Mississippi were actually against slavery. They saw it as an evil practice. Most of these were Christians coming over, again, from the colonies. And some of them still did not view slavery as anything necessary. Cotton was still kind of slowly getting started. But we really see when the beginning happens here in Mississippi, not many are very excited for the continuation of slavery in the state. But since it was already here, the Supreme Court of Mississippi ruled that slavery was already in Mississippi. It would remain there in Mississippi. As cotton became more important, here's a key aspect here. As it became more important to Mississippi's prosperity, the attitude of Mississippians will start to change on whether or not slavery should continue to exist, and the defense for it will also start to change as well. So kind of reading a little bit from our notes here, and looking at number 3, Sunday after Sunday, year after year, preachers warned Mississippians that God will reward the good and punish the wicked. And part of that early on was that, we do see in some historical texts that preachers are actually preaching that, if you supported slavery in Mississippi, that you would be going to hell. And so that literal interpretation of the Bible, looking at Exodus, looking at these different things, saying, hey, slavery is not good. The Bible tells us that, God's people were enslaved. They needed to be set free. Same thing should be for these people. But we're going to see that the eventual change becomes a necessary evil here at the top because of economic and political reasons. And so the institution of slavery meant that cotton could be produced in a greater abundance. So again, cotton's running our economy. It'll run our political agendas as well during this time. And so Mississippians begin to think of slavery as an unfortunate but necessary evil during this time. Go back here, reading in our notes. Look at number 9. When Mississippi was admitted to the state in 1817, most Mississippi whites considered slavery an evil system of labor that should be abolished. However, looking at number 11, the land boom of the 1830s prompted significant changes in the defense of slavery, looking at it as a necessary evil during the flush times. And then by number 13, the most intense element in the debate over slavery is not the morality of the institution anymore, but the expansion of slavery. All right. And so William Lloyd Garrison, 1831, this is around Jackson's period. His newspaper called for the abolishment of slavery. He was an abolitionist. Many during the Mexican-American War will start to say that you need to stop the expansion of it. We saw the reaction of Mississippians there as well. Whites will justify slavery by economic, religious, philosophical reasons, as well as racial reasons to control slaves, saying all these crazy theories about why blacks are different than whites physiologically, mentality, everything. Mississippians defended slavery not as an evil or necessary evil, but now as a positive good, saying that it's a good thing to keep them under control. It's a good thing for the economy. It's a good thing for the South. And so we're going to see how slavery kind of starts to pick up here, especially with the expansion into Western territories. So after the Mexican-American War, we start to see the defense for slavery intensify. Norths are trying to stop them from expanding out west. White Southerners thought the expansion of slavery westward was essential to their economic survival. As we start to see the slave population start to increase, you need more land to increase more of the slave population too. In the North, the reason why we see kind of the huge contrast and why the North would even care that the South would had slaves to begin with is that we start to see this these natural rights, or the belief of natural rights, really start to pick up after the American Revolution. Those ideas coming over from Europe, specifically France, and the Enlightenment, built there into our Constitution. Life, liberty, and property. Northern states, right after the American Revolution in the 1780s, will abolish the institution of slavery in the North, and so almost 100 years later, we'll see the South eventually give up slavery, but slavery became the symbol and focus of many differences between the North and the South, even as early as the late 1700s. If you've seen the movie, I guess now movie, but Broadway show Hamilton, that gets discussed a good bit there as well. So again, natural rights. The South, the North mostly agreed that natural rights of slaves was the foundation for them abolishing slavery. And then we get to 1860. This is the turning point, or the breaking point, as they put it here. The 1860 presidential election. We see a new party come onto the national stage here with the Republican Party. All right. So this is where today's Republican Party gets its start and its founding, and its first kind of political leader is going to be Abraham Lincoln. All right. So Abraham Lincoln is going up against the Democratic candidate here, who had kind of the most, push from the opposite side, and that's going to be John C. Breckinridge versus Lincoln is the real kind of battle here. And then you have this kind of side party, the Constitutional Union Party, who will nominate John Bell. All right. So Lincoln will win a majority of the Electoral College votes. He is there kind of in the reddish, pinkish color. I think it might be a salmon color. Somebody might want to check me on that color. But as we see, which states does he win? When we look at this map, the states that he wins are mostly all above that Mason-Dixon line. Okay? So remember the Mason-Dixon line that goes all the way across here. Everything north would be free states. Everything south would be slave states. All right? And then we see Breckinridge, who's a Southern Democrat. We did have a Northern Democrat in the race, Stephen Douglas. We'll talk about them some more. But he will only get Missouri, which is kind of one of those border states. The other border states will go to the Constitutional Union Party representative there with John Bell. So that's Virginia/West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And so none of the border states really go to one of the two major candidates. I say the exception maybe Maryland, but Maryland's still mostly considered the Union, or part of the northern states. And so just looking at this map, we see Lincoln gets almost 60% of the Electoral College votes, 40% of the popular vote. This is something we still see today. We're going to probably have issues with even in this election, but we see that when we look at the popular vote, Lincoln did not get a majority of the vote. Reason for that, you have three other candidates. All right. Today, we do have multiple candidates, but for the most part, the popular vote's mostly split between two parties now. And so this does not happen as much as it used to. But when we look at the Electoral College votes and the popular vote today, we see sometimes there are two big differences between the numbers. So you can win the popular vote by 1 million people, but depending on how many representatives there are in each state, New York's got 35, Pennsylvania's got 27, Ohio's got 22. You win those three states, you got a good chunk of the Electoral College votes. That may not be all the population centers of the entire United States, but because they have more Electoral College votes, you'll get more of the win, because the win comes from the Electoral College vote and not the popular vote. Reason for that, if we just went by the popular vote, New York City here, Houston, Chicago, Phoenix, Los Angeles, and some of these other West Coast cities. Those kind of five, maybe Philadelphia. But those kind of handful of cities, if we went by the popular vote, has a large portion of the U.S. population and would thus win. All you would have to do is go campaign in those 5 or 6 cities, and then you would win the election if we did it just on popular vote. And so the Electoral College is necessary because of that reason there. But again, looking at who wins the southern states, who wins the northern states, and then the border states again are very important. This picture, I just want to have y'all take a moment, look at this. But this map of the election of 1860 will tell you everything about what was going on, up until 1860 as to why this war happened. You had these northern states who are all under one kind of idea of what the Union should be like, and then you have all these southern states who all have their idea of what the Union should be like. And when their man does not win, they don't feel like they're being represented, they're going to want to leave. These border states are kind of caught in the middle as to what to do. And we'll talk a little bit more about what they end up doing later. All right, finally, we get to Mississippi seceding from the Union. Many Southerners predicted that the South would secede if Lincoln would be elected. And so Mississippi would become the second state to secede to the Union. We talked about this last class, but there was one state before Mississippi that seceded from the Union. That state would be South Carolina. We talked about some of the reasons for that as well. But most Mississippians believed that the North would allow the South to leave the Union peacefully, and did not believe that by leaving the Union that the North would even care. The governor here, Governor Pettis of Mississippi, strongly miscalculated this possibility, as did most Southerners. And so when they do leave, and when Mississippi does secede from the Union, this will lead to a civil war, which will kill more Americans than any war combined, all the wars together. 600,000 Americans will die. The reason for that, again, we have Americans fighting other Americans. So any casualty in this war will be American lives lost. All right, so that wraps us up for today, going through sections 1 through 3. The only thing else I'd like for y'all to do today is to watch the crash course video. I also have put up here. We'll watch, B-Day will watch this video as well. And it'll kind of talk a little bit more about the lead up to the Civil War and some of the stuff that happens early on. All right. Thank y'all for watching. Hope y'all have a good rest of your day.